the Happy Scientist podcast. Each episode is designed to make you more focused, more productive, and more satisfied in the lab. You can find us online at bitesizebio.com/happyscientist. Your hosts are Kenneth Vogt, founder of the executive coaching firm Vera Claritas, and Dr. Nick Oswald, PhD, bioscientist, and founder of Bitesize Bio.
Hello, this is Nick Oswald, welcoming you to this Bitesize Bio webinar, which today is a live episode of the Happy Scientist podcast. If you want to become a happier, healthier, and more productive scientist, you are in the right place. With me, as always, is Mr. Kenneth Vogt. In these sessions, we will hear from Ken mostly on principles that will help shape you for a happier and a more successful career. And along the way, I'll pitch in with points from my personal experience as a scientist and from working with Ken. If you have any questions along the way, put them into the questions box that appears on the right side of your screen, and I'll put them to Ken. And today we will be asking, does your science box you in? Okay, Ken, take it away.
All right. I want to add that today, especially, there's going to be a lot of input from Nick because I'm going to ask him a lot of questions, because this notion of having a particular perspective is one I'm familiar with, but I don't work in the lab. And so there are 3 points that are on the screen right now that I want to key on. The idea of are your ideas fresh? Is your mind open? Is your attitude healthy? And how that actually applies in the lab, because of course it applies all throughout your life, but and having a good perspective, well, not a good perspective isn't so much my point, but having a useful perspective is a good idea. The first thing we have to recognize is that we do have a perspective, and we might want to think about what that is by definition. And I was looking at the dictionary definition for perspective, and the first definition isn't about the kind of perspective I'm talking about here, but it is interesting. So here it is. Perspective is the art of drawing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface so as to give the right impression of their height, width, depth, and position in relation to each other when viewed from a particular point. Now, this is very familiar to us. It's familiar from from how we observe the world, but it's also familiar with this artistic rendition here. We've seen this kind of thing done, and we recognize it. And when you see something drawn that is without question two-dimensional, and yet you observe it as a three-dimensional rendering, you are using a perspective. And the artist actually had some say over what perspective you would have. And that's what this drawing is showing an example of. It's showing you where the perspective points might be. And I remember learning this in art class in high school, and it just kind of blew my mind. And you start to recognize that it is normal. It is how we observe the world. But now let's talk about the definition of perspective that I wanted to bring to this call today. That's the second one. Its perspective is a particular attitude toward or a way of regarding something, a point of view. Now, you might think that sounds restrictive, and in some ways it can be, but it also allows you to key in on something. So if we go back to that thing we talked about on the last slide, keeping your ideas fresh, maybe the answer is to change your perspective. To keep your mind open is to recognize that the perspective that you commonly have is not the only one. And having your science be healthy may well require you to change your perspective. So, Nick, I'll put this to you. Have you ever had a situation in the lab where you were required to change your perspective? Did anything come to mind there?
Well, I have not been in the lab for quite a long time, but I have. So I'm not going to talk about something specific, but for me, the one of the main, if I look at one of the main contours of where this thing could get tangled up, the perspective, it's the fact that when you're in the lab, you're doing science. Science is a particular way of examining a question. But on a personal level, in parallel, you have a motivation to get an answer, and you sometimes have a motivation to get an answer that would work for the bigger picture that you are personally looking for to make your paper or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that if it's quite easy to get pathed down that direction where you're just looking for the result. Not you're just looking for the result. Your primary perspective is, I need to get this result.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, you need to keep flipping yourself out of that personal perspective and into the scientific perspective, which is asking the question in the correct way and just seeing what happens.
Right.
So that would be one of the major pathings that I would have seen of myself and of other people in a lab situation.
Sure. And it's possible to have a really negative motivation. You know, you're wanting to please your funder. That could be something that would really, really torque your perspective. Or it could be selfish. I want a result to turn out a certain way because I've already put in all of this effort. I've put out papers on this topic. And if I get a different result, I'm going to have to change my view. I'm going to have to admit I missed something in the past, and we don't want to do that. But it isn't always all that negative. It may just be that this is familiar. I'm used to looking at it this way, and to change your perspective feels a little scary, or maybe a little painful, or it forces you to enter into the unknown, which is not a comfortable place. And so there's all kinds of reasons why you might not want to change your perspective. Now, there are other times when your perspective is going to be forced to change. Circumstances or just data is going to make you have to change your perspective. Something happens that doesn't make sense in the lab, at least from your present perspective. You're going to have to get out of that perspective to understand, how is it possible that I got these results? Now, obviously, sometimes it's possible because something went wrong. Something got corrupted. Something that was supposed to be kept out got in. Contamination, just outside influences that you were trying to control for, and the control failed. All right, all that's fine, but it will require you to recognize your perspective's got to shift. Now, well, let me move to the next slide, because I want to talk about this idea of viewpoint versus perspective, because they're not exactly the same. Viewpoint is in some ways kind of an application of perspective. And I like this little illustration because both individuals here are arguing for the truth, because they're looking at it. They have data that supports their viewpoint. But it is important to recognize that our viewpoints are often dealing with limited information. And so shifting our perspective may still make sense. I think science is often, its highest objective is to uncover what is true. And that is a laudable goal. But it is important to recognize that we do not have access to all data. We don't see everything at all times. And so we have to recognize that the conclusions that we draw sometimes may make sense for our subset of what is true, and may not make sense for the whole of what is true. And that's what recommends this notion of recognizing that perspective may be worthwhile to shift. So if we start to learn the importance for adopting different perspectives on our research, then you realize there's other possibilities. It opens things up. This kind of goes back to that idea of keeping your ideas fresh. When you recognize that it could be seen a different way, that may trigger your imagination to consider, what are the other possibilities? What else could happen? Your mind, of course, has to be open for that to happen. If you want to, if you've been working with some people and man, they're so creative and they've always got great new ideas, and you're thinking, why can't I have that? Well, the answer is, first, open up your mind, give it a chance. You have to allow for the possibility of something unusual to be there, something new to show up. This will impact what you discover, and it'll impact what possibilities you see, because there's a series of things going on all the time. This possibility opens up this idea, which opens up this possibility, which opens up this idea, and sometimes it's a couple of things down the line before you get there. But if you can keep yourself open to the possibility that my present viewpoint is not the truth, doesn't mean that you're wrong, doesn't mean you're a liar. It just means there's more to know. And of course, science is all about gaining knowledge. You're observing the observable world, but you got to observe, and you have to be dispassionate about those observations. Be open to the possibility that there's another way to see it, and if you do that, then you will be able to see it. And I'm sure you've all had that experience where you had a limited view of the world, and it was just the way you saw it, and then one day you just broke out of that, and everything got bigger, everything got better, everything got clearer, because you were willing to consider the possibility that things aren't as chiseled in granite as they may have first appeared. And sometimes we cling to that because, it just would be simpler if the world was simple, if everything was plain. But after a while, we kind of get that beat out of us because, we see from evidence that the world is not simple, that things are not always plain, and things don't always follow the same set of simplistic rules. And if you can allow for the fact that that is possible, well, then you can see other things. And you can actually use the anomalies to your advantage. There are some times when you can create an environment where something isn't normal, but in that abnormal environment, you can get a particular kind of result. I think it would be accurate to say a lot of science, that is exactly what it's about. It's about creating something abnormal that changes the result. So I will pause for a moment here and let you get a word in, Nick.
Just something that you said there just kind of sparked something for me that it's always been. I always thought was a bit of a peculiarity about science was that, and it's just it's a mind trap in a way. It's we talk about so much about what we know, and we talk up what we know, what we've discovered, the breakthroughs that we've made and all that. And that, of course, we do that because we're proud of that and we're excited about it and so on. But what that I always think lays the trap of falling into thinking you know more than you don't know. And of course, we don't know more than we know, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. We often don't even know what we don't know.
Exactly right. And so one of the flips, it's the useful thing that you're talking about here, and we've been talking about, is flipping between perspectives. Because staying in one perspective, okay, this is what I need personally. I need to get this result. That's fine. Okay, that drives you one way, but then you flip out it and go bigger picture. What does this? Am I looking at this from a pure scientific methodology point of view? Am I asking this in the right way? Am I being neutral and all that? That's another flip. Another flip is, instead of looking at what you know and what you think is going to happen next based on or what you think would be a good question to ask based on what you know, is flipping that around and saying, well, what don't we know? What might be the absolute left field here that that would, looking at it that way, it makes your imagination work in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And then it'll give you other ways to look at the problem or ways to look at the possibilities. And again, I think it's that I think that overall, what we're talking about here is having a flexible perspective. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's not always comfortable, because it does force us out of the familiar, and we like familiar. So I want to move on to an analogy.
Actually, before you say that, before we go to the next thing, it's not just about familiarity. Well, it's one thing is familiar, but that also is that there's a trend because there's pressures in science to get results.
Sure.
There's pressures from all around. And so being results driven, for example, is one external pressure that, especially if you're inexperienced, then you will tend to succumb to. And that can easily become more and more your fixed perspective is getting results. And even if you're more experienced, sometimes you're just under so much pressure to get, get what you need, that becomes the dominant perspective, and it's difficult to flip out into these other ones.
Sure. Well, and you make a good point there that there are a variety of reasons why anyone holds a particular perspective and why we hold a perspective. It isn't necessarily because, you're, unwilling to change or you're narrow-minded. There are all kinds of forces that are bearing down on us at any given moment, and we're going to respond to them, and it makes sense.
Yep.
So let me step back a little bit though to talk about the starting points for perspectives. This illustration here that's on the screen may be familiar to folks. It's an old Buddhist story about what happened when a bunch of blind men encountered an elephant, and because one walked up to the tail and one walked up to the tusk and one walked up to the trunk and one walked up to the side. They all had different perspectives. Well, it's like this, it's like that. None of them were wrong, but all of them were limited. And there was nothing that they were failing to do, but they did lack vision. And that lack of vision caused them to see things a certain way. And in the telling of the tale, they all just made declarative statements. It's like a rope. It's like a snake. It's like a sword. Instead of, it appears to be like it might be like this. The part, they didn't acknowledge that there were other possibilities, and that's kind of the point that you have to be at. Are you open to considering other perspectives? And can you hold more than one perspective at the same time? That is not intellectually necessarily easy to do, but y'all didn't sign up for an easy job intellectually. If you're lab-based scientists, you're doing hard intellectual work, and one of the skills that is worth gaining is being able to hold more than one perspective at the same time. And if you do that, then you don't get paths. Then you don't find yourself stuck in ruts. And to go back to the point you were making a little bit ago, Nick, it also can explain why is this particular perspective so compelling, and can I allow myself to be uncomfortable enough to consider a perspective that doesn't look at it from that viewpoint. And it may be that it's something you're just doing privately in your own head, right? Or it may be that, no, in this paper, I have to make a case for both scenarios. I've got to talk about what the funder would like to be true, but I also have to talk about what the funder would like to not be true, because I have evidence of the part they don't like. And you don't want to play fast and loose with your data, obviously, but you do want to consider all sides. And there is such a thing as risk management. And in risk management, you'd want to consider the outlier data. You'll want to consider the stuff that doesn't support the main perspective, but it does introduce some question about it. And opening those questions up may lead to further research and may lead down rabbit holes that are worth going down, but even if you're not going to pursue those things, just saying them out loud gets it on the table. And maybe it'll be pursued by other people, but maybe it's just a matter of it's an adherence to honesty. It's an adherence to it's a higher character. We don't call something 2 + 2 = 4 when it's not that certain that 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 most of the time. And we can say that. We can say that with integrity, and do that. Now, I mean, there are some things that they're always going to be, they always equal 4. And we do want to note that too. But especially in biology, things are analog. They're not so digital. They're not necessarily so perfect. We're talking about probabilities rather than certainties, and that's useful to recognize.
Yeah, I think one way of looking at this as well, though, is just noting down some stuff. Now, this is off the top of my head, so it might not be exactly right, but it strikes me that one of the things that is inherent in being a scientist is that you talked about science as an intellectual pursuit. It is, right? But so intellect, that means you need the ability to compute and act intelligently or think intelligently. But you also have to have motivation, right? You have to have rigor. You have to have creativity, and you have to be able to tell a story about what your research is saying overall. And each of those, intellect, motivation, intellectual approach, motivational approach, like discipline, creative approach, using your imagination, rigor, and storytelling, all of those require you to take a different perspective. And so you must be able to flip between them.
Mm-hmm.
And having one of those as the dominant, if having one of those as the dominant will make your life more difficult as a scientist, I think, if you stick in one or two of them. If you can get the 360, then that is going to make it much easier for you to be a rounded scientist. And I don't think that's a perfect list. Again, that was off the top of my head, but that is the sort of rounded, open perspective that you actually need to be able to cover all facets of the job of a scientist, I think.
Sure. And if you consider your fellow scientists that you most admire, that you have the most confidence in, they have the broadest possible perspective. And I'll bet in most cases, most of them would not claim that their perspective is the whole truth. They may know the state of their science better than anyone, and yet they know it can be known better. And that's how we keep pushing forward. When we recognize that I am naturally coming from a limited perspective. I am starting from where I am. That's always the case. And we may have spent years and years going down a certain path, and now we're quite connected to it. And so we have to make it a point to shake ourselves out of that. And I'm sure people like that somebody early on, they had some great insight. They've made some great discovery, and now their whole career is just about that. And they're a one-trick pony, and that's all they talk about, and that's how they see everything, and everything gets measured through that lens. And that is limiting. And whereas other folks, when they've had those early things, they didn't allow those early successes to stylize them. They kept their options open. So I want to talk about two ways that could go wrong. One is by tunnel vision, and the other is by siloing. And they're in some ways the same thing, but they're they offer the perspective from two different directions. One is about, backwards versus forwards. Another is up versus down. So tunnel vision is when you look at everything only from a narrow perspective, and there's only one way through, and you have to go that way. The solution to this is always that way. That can be very narrowing. The siloing is a little different. Siloing is when you get stuck in a particular discipline. Say, if it's like talking about the difference between how a biologist sees something and how a chemist sees something. It's a silo. If you only ever look at it through one of those perspectives, if you only ever look at it mathematically, if you only ever look at it statistically, if you only ever look at it through in terms of viability, and then we miss out on the underlying layers. Those are limitations to one's perspective, and we all find ourselves caught up in this on occasion. It happens, It's just good to recognize right now. Okay, I've got tunnel vision. Right now, I'm kind of siloed, and then we start to see there's a way to look outside of that. It's funny, when I was putting these slides together, those silos that are there on a farm where I grew up, there were silos like that all over the place, and it just made sense to have silos. You had a place to store grain, and it was, it kept it safe and kept it stored for long periods of time. Is useful. The siloing can be helpful to you in that you've got a deep perspective in your area of expertise that is useful, but it's still right there. You can't feed the cows out of the silo. You're going to have to pull it out of the silo and spread it around where the livestock can get to it. I don't have as much experience with tunnels, but some folks may have grown up in places where there were caves or where there were mines, and it does change your perspective because you are closed in, and sometimes it's dark and scary. And to me, the notion of tunnel vision is a lot more frightening, because I think most of us would not like to be accused of having tunnel vision, but being accused of being siloed is not quite as scary. And in fact, we may feel like it's not my fault. I was put over here in this department, and I'm told what to do, and I have to do it this way. And it's just how it is. Or they hired me so that I would be that statistician. That's why I'm here. I'm supposed to look at it that way. And that's all fine. To recognize that that's what's happening. That's how it is. And so what'll happen, sometimes you will be in a setting where you're presenting it from a particular viewpoint and other people are pushing back. And you got to recognize that that's okay. It was good that you could present it from the viewpoint you are coming from, but it's also good that others could take issue with things because they are seeing things from another perspective, and they're supposed to. And this allows for collaboration. It frees you up because, I can focus on this part of it because Bob is focusing on that and Sarah is focusing on that, and I don't have to focus on that. That they got it covered, and you can work together as a team, and you can go deep in each of your own areas, which is great. But you also obviously can learn from Bob, and you can learn from Sarah, and it can inform how you look at the the data that you have and the conclusions that you're drawing. So don't be afraid to do that, and not just afraid, but take advantage of it. Use it as an opportunity. It'll only broaden your horizons. So here's another interesting thing to consider. Since you do have a perspective, and sometimes it's a very select perspective, a single perspective, is it still possible to be innovative. It's still possible that new things can be discovered from this particular perspective, maybe even fairly called limited perspective. And the answer is yes. Sometimes limiting your perspective allows you to focus, and that's how you see patterns, because you're really focused on only this part of what's going on here. And so you will see things that somebody who's taking a broader view might not notice. It isn't that they're failing to look. It's just that you're laser focused. That's why there's microscopes, right? So that you can look very, very closely at things. And sometimes that is indeed a source of innovation. I guess my point is here, I'm not looking down on perspectives. I'm not looking down on viewpoints, or they have their purpose, but it is important that you know that you're coming from this perspective, you're coming from this viewpoint, so that you know the restrictions, you know the parts that are taken out of that view. Because there are some things that you can't know unless you look that close, but you do need to know that in this situation where you're working in the cryo lab, and at this temperature, this is what happens. But it's really important to know what the temperature was at which that happens, right? That's part of the perspective, is to know the limitations that are the defining characteristics of that perspective. Well, let me pause again here and let you speak up, Nick.
Yep, I think this is shaping up to be quite an interesting chat, actually. I'm just noting down some perspectives that I have had a experience in, which kind of allowed me to flip and get really, get a really different perspective, which informed my, how I approach the problem. So, for example, I worked as a biologist with only biologists for a long time, and then I moved to somewhere where I was working with lots of chemists. And that allowed me to take on the chemist perspective of the same problem. And I was looking at enzymatic catalysis, using enzymes to make chemical reactions happen. The way that biologists look at that is completely different from the way chemists look at that. And both of them can help inform each other. But as a biologist, you look at it in one way, and then as a chemist, you look at it in another way. I had an experience where I was a newbie coming into a company where they were trying to solve a particular problem. There was lots of very experienced people in there, and I came in. They talked about the problem, and I saw a flaw in the strategy only because I was new, and it turned out to be what they were looking for to change it. And that was, it's just an innocent perspective, or a naive perspective. Right. The different perspective is being in a comfortable situation where you don't need to make something happen, you can just keep ticking along, or being in a pressurized situation where you must make something happen. And those give you different perspectives. And then the one that I talked about before about in the lab looking to answer a question, or are you looking in the lab looking to get a result? And both of those are different perspectives. I think that's it. And as you said, it's just worth noting where you are, what perspective you have in the lab at the moment, or in your work, or whatever you're doing. This can be in any discipline, really.
Sure.
And what are some other perspectives you could flip to that could inform what you're doing? And you can always go back to the one you had in the beginning as well. It's just a mind exercise. Yeah.
Well, that leads into the next slide pretty well. Sometimes it's actually time to switch perspectives. And so what happens? Are you willing to do that? And, there may well be ramifications, and some of them may not be so pleasant. Some of them, maybe there's no scientific impact, but there's political impact. There's social impact. So all those have to be considered. If you're going to change perspectives, you're better off to do it mindfully, to be aware that this is what's happening here. If you find yourself just sliding into it or being pressured into it, it may not be a very smooth transition. So, you want to be able to do this. Switching perspectives is going to make you immensely more capable and more rounded as a scientist. And something you just said, Nick, about your experience there back in the lab when you were new to an operation, points out something that if you're a newbie, if you are younger and less experienced, it doesn't mean you don't have valuable observations. And sometimes it is good for you to speak up. Sometimes you need to be the little boy that says, "Hey, the emperor has no clothes," and others weren't brave enough to say it, or they were so past socially or politically that they just couldn't do it. And you actually give folks like that cover, and then they can take the ball from there. So understand, you don't have to solve every problem, but if you have a perspective that sees a risk, that sees a flaw, if you can voice it, if you can communicate it, it may well be that others then will pick up on that and take it to the next step. Even if you don't know what the next step would be, you might see a problem and have no idea how to solve it. But that doesn't mean others won't know how to solve it if they become aware that there's a problem. And what you add is that you're the person that points out there's something to look at here. So, don't be afraid to be engaged, whatever level you're at. Yeah, I will grant you that there's protocol, there's a proper way to introduce things. You don't want to just be a bull in a china shop, but look for your opportunities to make contributions, even if the only contribution that you can offer at the moment is to say something's wrong. It's okay. That's a perspective, and it's a useful perspective, especially when it's true. Even if it's not true, though, sometimes bringing it up allows the opportunity to point for someone else who's experienced to point out this is why this isn't broken and why it's okay. And it's a learning opportunity. So
I would also say I've been in the situation where I've not been the newbie, and a newbie has kind of been reeling off ideas that, I had that 5 years ago, it's like, but you must have, as an experienced person, you must give those people the room to get those ideas out, because it's a good thought exercise for them, but also they might just come up with a gem, something that you haven't thought about because you're looking at it in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So be willing to switch up, whether you're new or you're experienced, and because we just don't know what's going to happen next, what opportunities that it will raise. So that was everything I wanted to cover today. Is there anything else, Nick, you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, so just one other thing. This might be pointing out the obvious, but we're talking about, this podcast and Bitesize Bio in general aims to help scientists in the lab and beyond. So I was just thinking about how you apply this idea of perspective to your, this can also be applied to wider areas of your life. Mm-hmm. How do you look at things on it? What's your habitual way of looking at things? And is there a different way to look at it? And for example, your habitual way of looking at life could be looking at what you don't have and how to get it. Mm-hmm. And instead of that, you could flip it to, well, what if you trained yourself, or just stop to consider, well, what about what you do have, instead of what you, just focusing on what you don't have, then that's where gratitude comes from, I guess. Yeah. And what about, instead of habitually focusing on what you want, focus on what you need, and then how much of that you already have. It's just perspectives, and it's just so easy to forget that we all are programmed with certain perspectives, or we've habitually taken on certain perspectives, and that
we've programmed ourselves with it.
Exactly, yeah, and that really sets our worldviews. And so what we're talking about here is like a kaleidoscope. You can click around to different perspectives in the lab and your life, and see lots more colors.
Yeah. Well, see, I told you Nick was going to have a lot to say on this topic, so it proved to be so.
Well, I didn't know, but you opened up my perspective there. So.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Nick.
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for another very interesting topic. I don't know how you keep coming up with them. And thank you to the audience for listening.
I keep my perspectives open.
Oh, okay. There you go. And thanks to you all for listening in, whether that was live today or on the on-demand later. If you've enjoyed the content, please subscribe to the Happy Scientist on your favorite podcast platform and let your friends know, your colleagues know about this so that they can also benefit. We'll be having some other episodes coming up in the near future. You can check those out at events.bitesizebio.com. And until next time, good luck in your research and goodbye from all of us at Bitesize Bio.
Bye.
The Happy Scientist is brought to you by Bitesize Bio, your mentor in the lab. Bitesize Bio features thousands of articles and webinars contributed by hundreds of PhD scientists and scientific companies who freely offer their hard-won wisdom and solutions to the Bitesize Bio community.